Hello and welcome to another TLDR global video, which is guaranteed to get demonetized because it talks about death. However, it was chosen by our backers on Patreon, so let's get going with their support. This map shows all of the countries in the world where there's an ongoing conflict. The colours dictate how severe the conflict is by death count, but it's probably pretty shocking to see how much of the world is embroiled in conflicts. So in this video, we're going to walk you through some of the biggest conflicts and discuss these massively underreported stories from around the world, unpacking why so much of the world is dealing with significant conflict today. If you're interested in international news like this, as well as big stories like why Israel has had 4 elections in 2 years, China's attempt to kill Hong Kong's democracy, or the return of Ebola, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Currently, the vast majority of you haven't subscribed yet, and we'd love your support going forward. Thank you so much. So let's discuss how this map was created. Firstly, to qualify, a conflict must fulfill the following conditions. 1. There must be armed conflict between at least 2 organised groups. 2. Gang violence isn't typically included, unless there's a significant military involvement. 3. Territorial disputes or protest movements also aren't generally included, unless there's evidence of sustained state or paramilitary violence. And 4. All of the conflicts have at least 100 deaths total, are ongoing, and have at least 1 death in the last year. Even with those conditions, there are still 56 conflicts on the list, so we obviously don't have time to run through them all here. Therefore, we'll be grouping them by death count. There were 3 major wars, all of which have seen in excess of 10,000 deaths in the last year. Add to that the 13 wars, that's 1,000 to 999,000 deaths, 26 conflicts, 100 to 999 deaths, and 14 skirmishes, less than 100 deaths. Together, these 56 conflicts have led to in excess of 135,523 deaths in 2020, and more than 37,613 deaths so far in 2021. Those are clearly big numbers, so let's dive into the detail. Let's start with the deadliest, those categorized as major wars, starting with the Tigray War, a conflict involving Ethiopia, Sudan, and Eritrea. Despite the war only beginning in 2020, one of the newest on the list, over 17,000 people have already died, with the vast majority dying in 2021. The conflict in Ethiopia is between the central government, run by the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF. The TPLF ran Ethiopia from 1987 until Abiy took over in 2018, and the conflict started partly because the TPLF simply weren't happy about being ousted, and partly because Abiy wasn't particularly sympathetic to Tigrayan concerns. The conflict has mainly taken place in the northern region of Tigray, which is where the TPLF held regional government, but it's now an international affair. There are well-verified reports that the Eritrean army is also fighting the TPLF, and the conflict has displaced more than 50,000 Ethiopians to Sudan. We have a full video outlining this situation, so if you want to know more about this conflict, then there's a link to that video in the description. More deadly, though, is the Yemeni crisis, a conflict which has evolved in the years since it started in 2011, and while estimates vary wildly, has killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. The Yemeni crisis, like so many of these, is complicated, but at the heart of it, it's a civil war. Following the reunification of North and South Yemen in 1990, Saleh, North Yemen's former leader, took over control of the newly unified country. In 2011, he was toppled by his vice president Hadi, and this is where the situation escalated seriously. Iran backed Saleh and the Houthis who supported him, while the US, Saudi Arabia, and a number of other countries backed the new president. As with many conflicts in this region, religion plays a major factor, with one side being Shia Muslims and the other side Sunni. Anyway, with foreign involvement helping to escalate the crisis, the death count grew, with many believing the whole situation was being used as a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Things aren't getting better here either, with the US describing the humanitarian crisis as the worst in the world in 2019, and others more recently saying that there's no clear way out of the crisis, with factions fighting for control on both sides, and the major powers backing opposing forces. Longer running and deadlier still is the Afghan conflict, starting as the Soviet-Afghan War and then evolving as terrorist groups gained a foothold in the region. A lot of the world started paying attention to this conflict in 2001 though, following the attacks of September 11th and the US's invasion of Afghanistan. In the subsequent years, the US and their allies ramped up their presence in the region, with troop numbers beginning to decline in 2012. However, it's hoped that progress is being made to end the conflict, with the US and the Taliban signing an agreement in February 2020, setting out a timeline for the US to withdraw from the country within 14 months. As part of this agreement, the Taliban pledged to ensure that their territory isn't used by terrorist groups, as well as committing to enter into talks with the Afghan government. However, a year on and things don't look quite as rosy. Despite the deal, a ceasefire still hasn't come into place, with over 20,000 people dying in 2020 alone. A recent report to the US Congress found that the Taliban were becoming increasingly bold, had maintained relationships with Al-Qaeda, and were unlikely to compromise in negotiations with the Afghan government. As such, the Biden administration is reviewing the deal that their predecessors signed with the Taliban, with talks of them renegotiating the agreement ahead of the May 1st deadline for removing troops from the area. Biden doesn't really have any good options here. He could pull the troops as planned, but then the Taliban could feel like they've won, leading to them overturning the Afghan government. He could negotiate an extension, but that would take political capital and would delay the takeover yet again, leaving US troops in danger. Or he could just ignore the deal and keep going indefinitely, which would almost invariably lead to US deaths as the Taliban retaliate. It looks like there's no good options for Biden, and ultimately we'll have to wait and see what he ends up doing next. So those were the major wars, but what about the other wars? One which might have caught your eye, and the biggest one in 2020, was the Mexican drug war, seeing 8,404 deaths in 2020 and nearly 2,000 this year so far. This number might actually be conservative though, as it's often hard to tell the difference between deaths associated with the drug war and more general organised crime related homicides. Speaking about the latter, the situation is getting increasingly bad in Mexico, with marked year-on-year increases as the state tries to take on hundreds of thousands of cartel members. The situation really kicked off in the 1980s when gangs began organising, creating regional areas of control. These regional divisions didn't hold for long though, with cartels fighting for increased control and access. In 2006, the president declared war on the cartels, allowing the state to use military force against them. This approach was controversial though, with allegations that this military force only increased crime levels. Before getting elected in 2018, Mexico's current president promised a new approach to tackle the issue, pledging a new National Guard. 2 years later though, and his promises still haven't been delivered, and as The Economist bluntly stated, his signature policies for combating crime have not so far worked. This isn't the only drug war on the list though, with drug-related conflicts going on in the Philippines and Bangladesh too. The Boko Haram insurgency in Africa is another significant issue, seeing over 60,000 cumulative deaths, 8,200 of which happened in 2020, spanning across 4 different countries. This has been an issue for a while now, with insurgent groups repeatedly trying to corrupt and disrupt the politics of West African nations. But Boko Haram, Africa's largest terrorist group with links to the Islamic State, became a major issue in the early 2010s. Since then, numerous attacks, kidnappings and killings have taken place, including a major kidnapping which captured the world's attention in 2014. Since then though, the threat has continued, with an estimated 2.5 million people displaced in the region, and 244,000 refugees fleeing the country altogether. In recent years, things have calmed slightly and international assistance increased, but many are still deeply concerned about their presence in the region, especially in the light of many recent kidnappings. The Syrian civil war, despite seeing hundreds of thousands of cumulative deaths, was slightly less damaging in 2020, resulting in it falling down the rankings. This conflict might have started as only protests against Assad's regime in 2011, but it quickly escalated into a full civil war. In fact, even civil war underplays it, as the Syrian government is getting support from Russia and Iran, while the rebels have backing from the US, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and others. Things got yet worse in 2013 when the Islamic State began claiming territory in Syria, further promoting international intervention. The conflict still rumbles on to this day, with attempts at diplomatic resolutions proving unsuccessful, and half of the country's population displaced. So, those 6 conflicts barely scratch the surface of this issue, but hopefully you found it interesting to see how many conflicts there are around the world right now, as well as how many deaths it's caused. The vast majority of these are insurgencies and uprisings within countries, rather than big international wars. But with death tolls this high, it's important that we recognise what's happening and their importance. If you want us to do a full video explaining any of these topics, then like this video and comment below the war or conflict you'd like to hear us talk about. Also, let us know if you want this to become a regular series, where every 6 months or so, we update you on the status of global conflicts and what's changed. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon if you want to be updated when we release future videos like this one. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then be sure to back us on Patreon.